Imagine waking up one morning to find your entire city cut off from the outside world. No trains, no trucks, no barges. Food, fuel, medicine, everything you depend on suddenly stops. In June 1948, that's exactly what happened to over 2 million people in West Berlin. The Soviet Union had slammed shut every road, rail line, and canal leading into the city, hoping to squeeze the Western Allies into surrendering their foothold deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. Instead of retreating, the United States and Britain made a decision that seemed almost insane. They would supply an entire city by air every single day for as long as it took. In this video, we're unpacking how logistics planning and pure determination turned airplanes into lifelines, and how the Berlin Airlift became one of the boldest moves of the early Cold War. To understand why the Berlin Airlift mattered, we need to step back into the shattered world of 1948. Germany had been defeated, but peace was fragile and the Cold War was just beginning to harden. Berlin, bombed out, starving, and politically divided, sat like a geopolitical island, 100 miles inside the Soviet occupation zone. When the Soviets tried to force the Western Allies out by cutting supply routes, they weren't just targeting a city, they were testing whether the post-war order could be reshaped by coercion. In this episode, we'll follow the crisis from blockade to breakthrough and look at the aircraft, air crews, planners, and Berliners who made the impossible work. If you enjoy deep dives into history and strategy, consider subscribing and tapping the notification bell, and try to stay with me until the end, because the way this story concludes still shapes how we think about power and logistics today. When Nazi Germany fell in 1945, the Allies carved the country and its capital into occupation zones. The United States, Britain, and France controlled the western sectors. The Soviet Union held the east. Berlin itself, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was also split 4 ways. At first, cooperation was awkward but functional. That changed as the Western Allies pushed ahead with economic reforms, including a new currency for Western Germany to fight inflation and chaos. Stalin saw this as a direct threat to Soviet influence. Berlin, still starving and ruined, became the pressure point. The Soviets began testing the limits, delaying trains, harassing trucks, and tightening controls on access corridors the Western Allies used to reach their sectors. Behind the scenes, each side feared the other would turn Germany into a base for hostile power. The stage was set for a confrontation where supply lines, not tanks, would be the primary weapon. On June 24, 1948, the Soviet Union escalated from harassment to full blockade. Rail traffic was halted, barges were stopped, roads were closed with the simple excuse of technical difficulties. Overnight, West Berlin's lifelines were severed. The message to the Western Allies was obvious: abandon your positions or watch the city starve. West Berlin needed around 4,500 tons of supplies every day just to survive: coal for power plants, food, medicine, and basic goods. The Soviets assumed that number alone made an air-based solution impossible. The Western Allies faced a brutal choice: fight their way through, withdraw, or attempt something completely unprecedented. Military planners quickly ran the numbers. If they used every available transport aircraft, flying constantly, could they match the city's needs? The math was sobering, but just barely within the realm of possible. What followed was an extraordinary gamble: replace a railway with a skyway. There was one crucial factor the Soviets couldn't block: air corridors. In 1945, Allied agreements had guaranteed the Western powers 3 narrow air routes into Berlin. Stalin could close the roads without triggering open war, but shooting down Allied aircraft would be a much riskier escalation. U.S. General Lucius Clay pushed hard for an air solution, while British Air Marshal Sir William Douglas and others began sketching out what such an operation would require. The initial plan was modest: fly in enough food to buy time while diplomats argued. But as the blockade held and public opinion hardened, that stopgap turned into a full-scale logistical campaign. Every airport, runway, and transport aircraft in Western Europe suddenly mattered. This wasn't just about having planes. It was about turning the airspace above Germany into a highly organized conveyor belt, where every minute and every mile counted. The backbone of the Berlin Airlift was a fleet that looked, at first glance, fairly ordinary. American C-47 Dakotas, tough twin-engine workhorses from World War II, and larger C-54 Skymasters became the pack mules of the sky. The British contributed Yorks, Dakotas, and other transports. What made them extraordinary wasn't the hardware alone, but the tempo. Aircraft were loaded in West Germany in as little as 30 minutes, then dispatched along strict routes and altitudes to avoid collisions. They flew into Berlin's Tempelhof and Gatow airports on a schedule so tight that landings were sometimes spaced just 3 minutes apart. Each plane carried a carefully calculated mix of coal, flour, powdered milk, and other essentials. Turnaround on the ground was brutally efficient. Unload, refuel, and take off again. Pilots joked that if you missed your landing slot, you didn't circle, you went back home still full. To keep hundreds of flights safe in crowded airspace, the Allies developed a system known as the airlift conveyor belt. Planes flew east into Berlin at fixed altitudes and routes, and returned west at different altitudes and paths, like invisible one-way highways in the sky. Air traffic controllers in West Germany and Berlin coordinated every movement, using radar, radio, and strict timing. If a pilot missed a slot or ran into trouble, there was no room for improvisation. They were ordered to turn back rather than disrupt the entire flow. Weather was a constant enemy. Fog, ice, and crosswinds turned already demanding approaches into white-knuckle experiences. Instrument flying skills became crucial. Despite these dangers and the relentless pace, the accident rate remained remarkably low for such an intense operation, a testament to discipline, training, and the emerging science of air traffic management. Supplying food was challenging, but coal was the real problem. Berlin's power plants and heating systems ran on it, and without coal, hospitals and factories would shut down, and pipes would freeze in winter. Coal is heavy, dirty, and bulky. Everything you don't want in an air cargo operation. Yet the airlift planners had no choice. They devised special loading techniques, using sacks and later bulk loading methods with pallets and chutes to speed things up. Ground crews at Western airfields became models of industrial efficiency, pre-staging cargo so planes could be turned around in under half an hour. In Berlin, teams worked around the clock in all weather, often knee-deep in coal dust and mud, to unload and move fuel to critical facilities. The airlift gradually shifted from just averting starvation to sustaining an entire urban economy, all one payload at a time. While tonnage and timetables made headlines, the human side of the airlift was just as important. Pilots flew exhausting schedules, often making 3-round trips a day, 7 days a week. Many had only recently finished wartime service and now found themselves flying into a different kind of front line. Berliners, for their part, adapted to life under the constant roar of engines. Children learned to recognize aircraft silhouettes. Families queued for rations whose ingredients had arrived from the sky only hours before. Cooperation between crews and civilians was intense. Germans volunteered at airfields, helped repair infrastructure, and organized distribution. Despite lingering resentments from the war, a fragile trust grew as Berliners realized the Allies were committed to staying and to keeping them alive. The airlift turned former enemies into partners in a shared logistical struggle for survival. One of the most enduring stories of the Berlin Airlift came from an American pilot named Gale Halvorson, later nicknamed the Candy Bomber. After meeting children watching planes through the airfield fence, he promised to drop them candy on his next flight. He told them they'd recognize his plane because he'd wiggle the wings. Using handkerchiefs as parachutes, he and fellow pilots began tossing small bundles of chocolate and chewing gum over the city. What started as a personal gesture grew into Operation Little Vittles, with donations pouring in from across the United States. For Berlin's children, these tiny parachutes weren't just sweets, they were symbols that someone cared. For global audiences, the images became powerful propaganda, contrasting Soviet coercion with Western generosity. Halvorson's candy drops captured how soft power and small acts of kindness could matter as much as fuel and flour in a battle for hearts and minds. The Soviets did not sit idly by while cargo planes crisscrossed their occupation zone. They applied pressure short of outright war. Fighter aircraft shadowed the transports, searchlights and radio interference harassed crews, and propaganda blasted over loudspeakers and newspapers. Yet Stalin stopped short of ordering direct attacks. The risk of triggering a wider conflict with nuclear-armed powers was too great. Meanwhile, the airlift had a powerful psychological effect. The longer it continued, the more it signaled to Berliners that the West would not abandon them, and to the world that the Soviet attempt at coercion could be resisted without tanks. Diplomatically, it boosted Western resolve to create stronger institutions like NATO. Logistically, it gave the Allies a real-time laboratory in large-scale, sustained air transport, experience that would influence military and humanitarian operations for decades. By early 1949, the airlift had evolved from a desperate improvisation into a finely tuned machine. New runways were built, including Tegel Airport in the French sector, constructed in an astonishingly short time with massive German civilian participation. At peak, planes were landing in West Berlin every 30 seconds during some periods, delivering more supplies than the city had received by land before the blockade. Meticulous data tracking allowed planners to adjust cargo loads, flight schedules, and maintenance cycles for maximum effect. Engineering solutions like de-icing systems, improved navigation aids, and standardized loading procedures pushed aviation logistics forward. The blockade, intended to demonstrate Western weakness, was now showcasing Western organizational strength. Each successful day made it politically harder for the Soviets to justify continuing a strategy that was visibly failing to break the city's will. On May 12, 1949, after nearly 11 months, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade. Trains rolled again, roads reopened, and barges moved along canals into Berlin. Yet the Allies didn't stop the airlift immediately. For several more months, planes continued to fly, stockpiling supplies in case the Soviets tried again. In total, the operation lasted 15 months and delivered around 2.3 million tons of cargo in more than 275,000 flights. 79 Allied personnel lost their lives in accidents, a reminder that this victory came at real cost. Politically, the crisis ended with West Berlin firmly anchored to the Western camp, and the emerging outlines of Cold War Europe hardened. The Berlin Airlift showed that logistics could blunt a blockade, that air power could sustain a city, and that patience and planning could sometimes outmaneuver brute force without a shot being fired. Looking back, the Berlin Airlift offers several powerful lessons. First, logistics isn't a back-office detail, it's a central instrument of strategy. The ability to move food, fuel, and people under pressure can decide whether cities survive and alliances hold. Second, constraints can drive innovation. The desperate need to keep Berlin alive accelerated advances in air traffic control, cargo loading, navigation, and coordination that reshaped modern aviation. Third, material aid and moral messaging are intertwined. Candy parachutes and coal deliveries both mattered, not only for survival, but for shaping how millions viewed the emerging Cold War. Finally, the airlift underscores that deterrence doesn't always mean firepower. Sometimes the most effective response to aggression is to out-organize and out-sustain your opponent. As we face modern blockades, sanctions, and supply chain shocks, the skies over Berlin in 1948-49 still have a lot to teach us. If this deep dive into the Berlin Airlift helped you see history and logistics in a new light, there's much more we can explore together. This channel focuses on the hidden machinery behind major events, the supply chains, decisions, and technologies that shape outcomes long before the headlines. If you haven't already, consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes on Cold War standoffs, modern blockades, and the logistics behind today's crises. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Which part of the airlift surprised you most, and what parallels do you see in today's world? If you know someone interested in aviation, strategy, or history, sharing this video really helps the channel grow. And if you want a follow-up episode, maybe a technical breakdown of flight operations or a profile of the Candy Bomber, let me know below.